Good afternoon. Welcome to Policy Exchange. My name's Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being chair of the event series that we're presently running on Republican perspectives on national security strategy with leading figures from the Republican and national security firmament in the United States. And it's our particular honour today to be able to welcome Ambassador Robert O'Brien, 27th National Security Advisor of the United States, the last of Donald Trump's national security advisors during his first term in office between 2019 and 2021, and one of the most consequential holders of that particular office. Welcome from the United States today, Ambassador O'Brien. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to hearing what you've got to say. We'll do a brief in-conversation, then hand it over to the distinguished audience for questions. Just a quick thing, Ambassador O'Brien, I noticed in the UK papers the last few days we've had several Chinese officials quoted saying that Democrat and Republican candidates are both equal poison as far as they're concerned in terms of US-China relations. Ain't no difference between the two of them as part of what they see as this great US Sinophobic so-called consensus. Just interested, how actually would a second Trump term differ from one, the outgoing Biden administration, to what Kamala Harris might do if she became president, and both vis-a-vis China and more broadly across the policy piece?
Well, Lord Godson, great to be with you. So thank you for the invite to join you in this distinguished panel. And I know some of my colleagues have come before me, and you'll see some great colleagues coming after me on this series. So nice to be with you. Look, I think the Chinese are onto something. They don't mean to be, but they are. And that's, I tell people, perhaps the most consequential policy change of the Trump administration was creating a bipartisan consensus that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat to our way of life and a threat to how our kids and grandkids will live. And that was not always a bipartisan concern. Republicans were more concerned about that than the Democrats. But I think we did develop a broad consensus, watching what happened in Hong Kong, watching what happened in the South China Sea, watching what happened with India, with the attacks on the Indians. I think Democrats woke up to the challenge and the threat, which is existential, of the CCP to America and our allies in the West. And so I think there is some truth to what the Chinese say, that the Biden administration, and I assume the Harris administration, will be tougher on China than past Democratic administrations. I mean, there won't be a Clinton effort to get them into the WTO or a broad policy of accommodation to China. But I think that the difference between a Democrat administration, a Harris-Walz administration, and a Trump-Vance administration is going to come down to the fundamental issue, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, more, of peace through strength. The Democrats and the Biden administration constantly talk about de-escalation and not provoking our adversaries. And those are just different words for appeasement, but appeasement's not popular anymore. At one time, it was quite a popular policy, as we know. Here, it's coming across. I'm getting a message that there's an audio issue, but hopefully you're getting this. Neville Chamberlain was quite popular coming back from
Oscar.
Right, appeasement doesn't work. Lord Godson, are you getting this?
Only intermittently, if you can hear us. I'm just going to turn to our technical team here. Is there?
Oh, I can hear you, but I mean,
okay, we can hear you again. Now you're 100% clear, Ambassador. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, great. I'm sorry about that. What I was going to say, Lord Godson, is that, look, I think the big difference between Republicans and Democrats in foreign policy, it's peace through strength versus not provoking our allies, our adversaries, and not escalating with our adversaries. And so it's kind of an appeasement type approach. And I think that would be favorable to China. So I think at the end of the day that they'd prefer to have a Democrat. We know that from the last election, they preferred Biden as their candidate. And I'm sure in this case they prefer Kamala Harris. But I do think there's a bipartisan consensus that China and the Chinese Communist Party are a threat to our way of life.
And thinking more broadly just to the previous Trump administration, obviously, which you were intimately involved with, and I think one of the questions which US allies, not least in the UK, are asking is how different, in what ways would a second Trump administration, if the former president is elected this November, how would it differ from last time round because of the ways in which the world have changed, whatever?
Well, look, we're dealing with a much more dangerous world than we left. We left with on January 20th, 2021, with peace and security. We didn't have an invasion, renewed invasion of Ukraine. Israel was making peace with its Arab neighbors. We had Iran boxed up, and the maximum pressure campaign, it limited their foreign currency reserves to $4 billion. They were running out of money. They couldn't pay Hezbollah. China knew that Taiwan was a red line, and they wouldn't think about having invaded Taiwan with President Trump in office. So now we have a very different world that we're going to have to deal with, that President Trump is going to have to deal with if he returns to office, and I hope he will. It's going to be a very close election here, 50-50, but I think President Trump, I think the American people will elect President Trump. And I think what our allies should do in trying to gauge how a Trump administration would respond is to look at the last 2 years of the Trump administration. There were really kind of two Trump administrations, and a lot of it was policy, it was not policy driven, but personnel driven. When the president came to office, he wasn't a politician. He didn't know Washington. He didn't know people in Washington. He had a small group of people that ran his campaign for him, but it wasn't enough to take over the levers of government. And so he had aides and staff and cabinet secretaries who didn't always agree with him, who didn't agree with his America First policy, didn't necessarily agree with the peace or strength policy. Some of them wanted to, really double down on what President Trump called the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it took President Trump about 2 years to get the team in place that he wanted. And once he got that team in place, you saw just a flurry of policy victories for the president, for America, and I posit for the West. We saw, of course, the Abraham Accords with Israel making peace with 4 of its Arab neighbors and Kosovo, a Muslim majority country in Europe. So a peace treaty with 5 countries, the Abraham Accords, Morocco, Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Kosovo. We saw economic normalization between Serbia and Kosovo, which had been at each other's throats for years. We saw the healing of the Gulf Rift, the end of the embargo that Saudi Arabia and Egypt and UAE had put on Qatar, which was very difficult for both the UK and for the US because both countries have bases and both had military relations and bases on both sides of that rift. We got that healed. So we saw a peace deal in Afghanistan, which held. We didn't have an American killed in combat in Afghanistan from February 2020 to January 21st, 2021. So we had a year of no combat deaths in Afghanistan because of that deal. And we were fighting ISIS-K and working on negotiations for government of national unity in Afghanistan. So you saw peace breaking out. And I think the result that peace was a result of American strength. Not just military strength, but diplomatic strength, economic strength, energy independence. And the fruits of peace or strength, and look, I grew up in the Reagan years, and I'll wrap up with this. We like to talk about how many carriers we've got, and the UK now has a couple to add to the mix with the Prince of Wales and Queen Elizabeth, and that's terrific for the West. But we like to talk about how many aircraft carriers, how many fast jets do we have, how many 5th generation fighters do we have, how many divisions do we have? That's the strength part of the equation. It's important. But peace or strength isn't about international bragging rights. It's not about who's got the most jets or ships or weapons platforms. It's about getting peace. It's about getting the fruits of that strength. And when you look at the last 2 years of the Trump administration, I posit that if any other president had done what President Trump had done, they would have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at least twice over. Because you want to be strong so that you can get to a world in which there's no war and in which we have peace. And we had that in the second half of the Trump administration. I think you'll see it again in a new Trump administration.
And going back to you was describing the new consensus in the United States on Asia historically, the Asia-Pacific region, historically the divisive area within the US polity from who lost China in the late 40s, Korean War, Vietnam, etc. And Europe was the uniting theatre, as it were, of operations. In recent years, it's moved the other way around. Asia is the uniting force, the consensus you've described on China. Europe more divisive. And one thing which interests a huge number of people here, of course, is I think it was Andrew Neil, one of our best-known broadcasters, said that some of the Republican voices that we now hear a lot of sort of sound vis-a-vis Russia, Putin's Russia, more like Jeremy Corbyn than the GOP that they knew during the latter Cold War years and the initial post-Cold War years. And just be very, very interested in your perspectives of the kind of voices, the balance of forces now within the GOP and who's going to come out on top.
Yeah, so look, I think there's a concern with Europe, and there has been over the past several years, that America's more concerned about European security than the Europeans are. And that can't hold. And like I exclude the UK and put them to the side a little bit with this because the UK has paid, 2% of its GDP for several years on defense. It has never been the scofflaw on NATO that some of the other partners have been. The UK troops will always go outside the wire when they're operating with us. They've got exquisite capabilities. We'd like to see more, of course, and look, there was some talk at one point of mothballing the two carriers. The two British carriers are critical to the West because they can patrol the North Atlantic and free up a carrier for the United States to go over the Pacific, where we've got the huge threat from China. So I'd exclude the UK, but when you look at Europe, take a look at Germany, for example. And look, I love the Germans. They're a great ally, but Germany's got the best lobbying in Washington of any country in the world, better than Israel, better than any country you can imagine. I mean, think about this: the Germans never get criticized. They buy cheap commodities and oil and gas from Russia. They sell expensive, finished goods, Audis and BMWs and Porsches and Mercedes to China at a big profit. The US and the UK have covered their defense for many years, so they don't have a defense bill. And they run a budget surplus and take care of their folks with generous social programs. I mean, I call it the German first foreign policy. And if you're German, hey, good for you that you've convinced the US to cover your defense while you trade with our adversaries and enrich the Russians and Chinese. So I think there's Americans believe that Europe needs to step up further on defense. Ukraine's a classic example. Early in that's starting to happen, but early in the conflict, it was the U.S. that was supplying all the equipment, the platforms, the weapons, the ammunition, and Europe, kind of stood by and took in a few refugees and said that was enough, and it wasn't enough. The Europeans have to contribute to Ukraine's defense budget. They have to contribute to rebuilding Ukraine. They have to contribute to aid, at least at the level of the United States, and I'd argue more. And so I think a lot of the frustration you're hearing on the GOP side, I don't think it's isolationism. I think it's a time to talk about allies stepping up and like an alliance is not a one-way street. It's not the U.S. coming in and defend you. It's you working with the U.S. to defend the West and the free world. And it's not America America first isn't America alone. It's America working with our allies. And I think that's it goes back to Churchill's famous statement that the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting a war without allies. And so I think the GOP is united on the idea that we need to work closely with our allies, especially the Western Europeans. I shouldn't say Western Europeans, that's a little old school. The Europeans and some of the strongest countries in Europe, of course, are like Poland and Czechia and Romania are great allies in the East. We need to work with those countries and make sure Europe is secure. But we also need to make sure that they're stepping up and especially with the Germans, paying their fair share and burden sharing with us.
Of course, here there's a big debate about the 2.5% target, which the new government is committed to, but it won't give a time frame on that. I'd just be grateful of whether you'll be willing here to sort of benchmark that from the point of view of where any future Trump administration might come in.
Well, look, I think it's a terrific goal, and so I compliment the new government and new labor. It's certainly different than old labor on that goal, but I think it has to be done quickly. This isn't something that, Chancellor Schultz gave a great speech after Ukraine was invaded and said everything's changed. We're going to have a massive defense budget. We're going to put all kinds of money into Ukraine. We're going to rebuild the German military. We're going to defend ourselves, and none of that's happened. And so talk is cheap. I think what President Trump will look for, and America will look for, is action. And so, the great thing about the UK is when the UK makes these commitments, they can fulfill them. They've got terrific shipyards in Scotland. They build a high quality kit. No one's ever questioned the capability of the Royal Navy and British sailors, and of course British Marines are the have the other half of the hemisphere from the Eastern Hemisphere. We got the Western Hemisphere with the U.S. Marine Corps. You've got great special forces with SAS and SBS and Marine Commandos. So a strong UK is just tremendous for the West, tremendous for America, and the sooner we can get to a 2.5% defense spending level in the UK, the more secure the free world will be, both in the transatlantic theater, but also in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I thought it was great that the Queen Elizabeth and her task force with some American Marine fast jets, F-35 Bs on board, made that great tour of the Pacific and did exercises with the Royal Australian Navy, the Japanese Navy, Self-Defense Force, and the American Navy and other partners in the Pacific. That was a great show of strength for the West and the free world in the Pacific, and it was great to see the UK leading that effort.
And of course, we had here recently, as part of this series, your former colleague, perhaps future colleague, Elbridge Colby, and he was sort of pushing in the direction that European nations, continental European nations, and the UK should be focusing on what would be European NATO, EU theatre, i.e. dealing with Russia, and less of a role in the Indo-Pacific. Just be grateful. Of course, that in some ways taps into what some elements within the present new UK administration would like to do. So there's a dovetailing there. Just be interested in your thoughts on those. The question is, everyone agrees the UK should play a part, but the question is where and what the priority should be.
Yeah, so I would look. Bridge is a very smart guy, and I agree with him on a lot of things. There's some things we probably are not totally in accord on, but he's a very important voice in the party and in the United States foreign policy, the foreign policy establishment here. I think Bridges' point goes more to the continental Europeans, perhaps, and I would accept the UK and France from his comments. I mean, keep in mind, France has a massive presence in the South Pacific with the French Polynesia, Tahiti. They've got New Caledonia and other possessions. The UK has traditionally played a very important role as a security partner and has a treaty alliance with Australia, with Malaysia. And both France and the UK have a power projection potential with their navies and their air forces that unfortunately the continental Europeans don't have. So the modification I'd make to what Bridge said is I'd focus more on the continental Europeans playing a role in European security, and probably a first priority for France and the United Kingdom, of course, is security of the Atlantic, the North Atlantic and South Atlantic, and the continent. But I think there is an important secondary role especially for France and the UK, because they can project power and they've got the ships to do so, the amphibs with the French and the aircraft carriers with the UK, the Royal Navy to get out in the Pacific and play an important role if it's necessary. And those are historic ties that the UK has with Australia and Malaysia and Singapore and its partners in Japan, its partners in the Pacific. So I think there's a real role for the UK to play in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps not the lead role, but certainly a key role.
Thank you. And final question from me before turning over to the audience here, the live online audience, relating to questions around wider Middle East. Two specific ones. One, the Abraham Accords. What more a future Trump administration might do to sustain, enhance those? Second, obviously, as you'll have seen, the new UK government has departed appreciably from the policy of its Conservative predecessor on policy towards the current conflict in Israel, Gaza, in three ways. One, taking the lock off the lock that had been placed on UNRWA funding, 2 on the International Criminal Court, on the locks that they'd placed on that, and 3, the potential, yet to be decided, but in play in terms of internal UK government discussions, perhaps most significantly on a weapons embargo on Israel. Just be grateful for your thoughts on that range of questions on the Middle East before turning over to the online audience.
Sure, I'll just make 2 quick points on the Abraham Accords. Number one, look, the Abraham Accords are important strategically, right? Because we pulled together the Sunni Arab countries and American partners with Israel, and that was a bulwark against Iran. But we don't focus enough on the peace and the fruits of peace. I mean, I was in Israel recently, and I saw some pilgrims coming from the UAE that were coming to the Temple Mount to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that's opened up. So Jerusalem is a very important city to our Jewish friends and our Christian, my Christian people and our Arab friends, but Muslim friends. And now it's open. And every time I go on TikTok, or show to TikTok, I don't actually have TikTok and would put it on my computer and advise people not to put it on their phones. But if I'm showing a TikTok video or an Instagram Reels of a bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, it brings a smile to my face. So that there's just a people-to-people blessing that came from the Abraham Accords beyond the economic integration of the region and the security integration. But I think it's important. I think that, we were on the verge of bringing the Saudi Arabian, the KSA into the Abraham Accords, and I think there are other countries like Oman, Kuwait, Qatar that would join in the second Trump administration. So I think there's real promise for the Abraham Accords. I think part of October 7th and the Iranian attack, and I call it the Iranian attack, the Hamas is just a cat's paw of Iran in that attack, was to try and slow down the negotiations that were taking place between the Biden administration and Saudi Arabia, the KSA, on normalization with Israel. So I think there's a lot of potential for the Accords going forward, and I think that the blessings of the Accords aren't just economic and military, but it's just the idea that you can have peace among men, and that's maybe it may sound a little fuzzy and woolly, and for someone who's kind of known as a defense hawk, but I think it's important. On your issue with Israel and the UK, number one, I'd say the ICC is really an impediment to peace in the region. I mean, the idea that they would go after and target a democratically elected leader, prime minister, and his defense minister, and pick and choose between which Israeli leaders they like and dislike with their investigations, and not go after some leaders and go after others. But to do that to a democratic country that has a JAG Corps in their army, that has lawyers doing targeting, involved in every targeting decision, that does everything it can to minimize civilian casualties in a way that the U.S. doesn't do. We don't drop flyers on buildings and say, hey, we're going to bomb a building soon, let everyone get away. That's not something the U.S. does. We don't use social media to tell, and the UK doesn't do this either, to tell civilians to get out of areas where there may be an attack where we know they're adversaries. And keep in mind, that sort of concern over civilian casualties by the IDF and by the Israelis has led to a number of Israeli deaths, because it's allowed, if they tell a building to clear and that they're going to come in, the Hamas isn't stupid. They put IEDs, they set up ambushes, and they kill Israeli troops because of the humanitarianism of the IDF. So for the ICC to go after the Israelis is a joke. I think in a Trump administration we put sanctions on the ICC, and frankly, I think the ICC investigators and prosecutors and judges, if they take this up, may potentially, I'm not, be very careful about this, they may open themselves up to criminal liability in national jurisdictions, whether it's in Israel or some other country that disagrees with the role they've accorded to themselves as some sort of arbiter of who's good and who's bad in the world, and their prosecution. But it's particularly egregious in Israel, and the UK ought to do everything it can. And I think it's a UK national who's the prosecutor, the UK should take every step necessary to shut it down. As far as the arms embargo goes, that there is a potential there for a serious rift, whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration, between the UK and the US. And I would tread very carefully. I never presume to instruct a foreign government or to give advice to a foreign government on how to conduct their affairs. But like the F-35 is a joint project. That F-35 is going to Israel. It's going to continue to go to Israel no matter what Turkey or the UK or any other country has to do with it. You'd hate to see a situation where, you know, the UK is no longer a partner in the F-35 project, or other advanced platforms because of a very ill-advised arms embargo against Israel. I think that would hurt the UK in either a Democrat or Republican administration. And I think the consequences of that kind of an arms embargo on Israel is something the UK really needs to think about at a time when Russia and China are posing a massive threat to the West to get involved in that kind of a situation. And keep in mind, a lot of high tech that the UK relies on, comes either directly or indirectly through Israel. The U.S. is not going to walk away from Israel. We're not going to put an arms embargo on Israel. And any of our allies that do are floating with real danger, and may imperil their ability and their own supply chains on the arms front. And their ability to sell. Look, we're buying a lot of BAE products in the U.S. with our military. An arms embargo would certainly lead to congressional action to put a counter embargo my guess is to put a counter embargo on any UK sales to the US. So I think that's an extraordinarily dangerous policy proposal. It has the potential to tear apart the special relationship and to really hurt the Western alliance and NATO. So I'd advise against that. And I think your third question was just
It was
the
unwrong, but I
overall.
think we've got some people, because I know we've got limited time now. There may be others who ask it. I just see one or two people coming in now on the from the audience, big online
Great.
audience
So,
here.
sorry, Lord Godson. That's the danger of handing over the microphone to a litigator and a lawyer is you get filibustered.
It's no worry to us at all. I see a question from Latika Burke of Sydney Morning Herald. Latika, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello, yes. Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Your question, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Latika Burke from The Nightly Australia. Donald Trump has not said a lot about his thinking on AUKUS. It was obviously signed by Joe Biden. And when Biden departs, there will be no original author of the AUKUS program left in terms of the three leaders who signed off on it. What is your understanding about the viability of the program? Do you think it's something that the Trump administration will have the same investment in seeing succeed as Biden?
Yeah, Latika, great question. I understand that the Biden administration authored AUKUS, but I harken back to my first week as National Security Advisor. We had the state visit of Scott Morrison to the United States and had a wonderful dinner and sang the Marine Corps and Army choruses sang Waltz and Matilda to end the evening. And I don't think there was a dry eye in the house. The alliance between the U.S. and Australia is strong. It's enduring. I worked very closely with the Australians and Kiwis as well when I was a hostage envoy before becoming National Security Advisor, and then worked very closely with Australia as National Security Advisor. So, I don't think there's any pride of authorship issue on AUKUS. We're not like the Democrats. The Democrats came in and anything that Trump did, they rescinded whether it was good or bad, and then they kind of instituted a number of our policies. AUKUS is great. I think it'll find a lot of support in the Trump administration, and I think Australia has some wonderful advocates like Scott Morrison, who are advocating for AUKUS, and I think it'll be a bedrock of defense and peace and security in the Indo-Pacific for many years to come, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat president. It makes sense. We're probably a little too harsh with the French when we signed up AUKUS, and I think the biggest concern anyone should have is how the French reacted to Biden and the way AUKUS was rolled out. But aside from the rollout, I think it's a great strategic initiative and a great industrial base initiative, and it'll be great for Australian national security and American national security. So I think that's something that will be embraced, and be strong long into the future.
A great note on which to end. No more questions, despite the great interest in this outstanding session. Ambassador, thank you for coming online here. As I say, our mission is an educational one. You have educated us about many of these vital matters at this key campaign season in one of the most important presidential elections in recent years. We look forward to hearing much more from you, from your colleagues. As I say, a wonderful crescendo for this series on Republican national security thinking in our time. So thank you. Look forward to welcoming you back soon. Thank you to all our online audience for coming. We look forward to welcoming you back here as well, either online or in person in the very near future. Thank you. Over and out.